I'm John Leonard from Weill Cornell Medicine and New York Presbyterian Hospital in New York. There are a number of new treatments for mantle cell lymphoma, and it's been very exciting that we've seen such promise in mantle cell and improvements in outcomes for large numbers of patients. In the past, we simply had chemotherapy as the main treatment. We have a number of treatments that came onto the scene after that, agents such as rituximab, lenalidomide, and bortezomib. And in recent years, we've had a number of new agents that I think have made even more dramatic strides for patients. These include a whole category of drugs called BTK inhibitors, or Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors, that are pills that can make a difference for people with mantle cell lymphoma, mostly as a second or third or beyond treatment. Another category of drugs that has made a difference for patients with mantle cell lymphoma and other types of lymphoma include CAR T cells, which are a form of therapy where the patient's own immune cells are removed from the patient through a fancy blood donation, engineered to better fight the lymphoma, and then given back to the patient. So these two categories, I would say Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors or BTK inhibitors and CAR T cells, have been the biggest advances and made the biggest difference for patients in recent years. There are a number of new agents that are being explored for mantle cell lymphoma right now. One of the earlier, or I think key issues, is do we take drugs that are approved and used as a second or third or fourth treatment? Do we use them as part of the initial treatment? And does that derive benefit for the patient by starting some of these newer therapies early? Or do we stick with some of the older therapies and save the newer therapies for later? A second part of things is really to try to identify groups of patients that have higher risk disease or lower risk disease, patients that we expect to do better or worse based on various factors, either clinical factors such as their age and other laboratory tests, or patients that might have certain genetic abnormalities in their tumors or other features that would suggest that we should choose one therapy over another. So deciding based on certain molecular factors or other tests, do we give more or less therapy is really an essential part of things so that we tailor the treatment much better to the patient. One example of that is an ongoing study that is looking at whether or not patients who have an excellent remission, what we call MRD negative, meaning we can't see any traces of their mantle cell, even at very sensitive testing, whether those patients should go on to get a high-dose chemotherapy regimen and autologous, or from themselves, stem cell transplant, which is commonly used for some patients with mantle cell lymphoma. So again, a lot of it is focused on targeting the right treatment to the right patient and figuring out who should get what as opposed to treating everybody the same. And then finally, there are a number of new agents that are being studied, that are being explored. There are newer versions of the BTK or Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors that are being tested that may work when some of the other drugs don't work. There are what we call bispecific antibodies, antibodies that are immune proteins that with one arm of their immune protein structure can bind the tumor cell, and with the other arm can bind immune cells like those T cells. Those are being studied in a variety of lymphomas, including mantle cell. We have a category of drugs called antibody-drug conjugates, where these immune proteins are infused and deliver a chemotherapy drug more specifically to the tumor cells. And then there are a variety of new drugs that work in different ways, ranging from pills to immunotherapies to stem cell transplants and modifications of that, including new CAR T cells and other immunotherapies. So there's really a lot happening as part of clinical trials. I believe that a clinical trial is an option to consider for really any patient with lymphoma, including mantle cell lymphoma, at any point that they need to make a treatment decision. One of the kind of historical or perhaps misconceptions about clinical trials is that, well, that's only something you do when you don't have any other options, when you're kind of out of possibilities for treatment. But in fact, there are important new advances being studied at really every step of the way for a patient with mantle cell lymphoma. So we have observational studies, not clinical trials, but observational studies where patients may donate blood or donate their biopsy sample or other information that gives us a way to essentially learn about them and their disease in a way that could help patients and understand outcomes. But when we talk about clinical trials, mostly we're talking about therapies or new treatments. And there are clinical trials that are studying new therapies or new approaches for patients who are newly diagnosed, for patients who just had a relapse, or for patients who have been through a number of therapies over time, and finally patients where the other options are really quite limited and where newer things are being trialed. So every step of the journey, I think a patient should ask their doctor and explore with their caregivers and other sources of information, should they consider a clinical trial. The goals of the trial might be a little bit different. The options available might be a little bit different. For instance, a newly diagnosed patient generally wouldn't receive a drug that is really early in the clinical development, but they might participate in a trial where they might receive a standard therapy or a twist on the standard therapy, where we're trying to see, does that make things work a little bit better and moving the standard treatments forward, even as part of a group of patients receiving their first therapy. Clinical trials are really a very important treatment option for patients with mantle cell lymphoma because they offer a number of new possibilities. First of all, patients treated on a clinical trial or as part of a clinical trial can often be receiving a therapy that has been vetted and evaluated and developed as a treatment regimen with the input of many, many people, including other physicians, other lymphoma experts. It can include different regulatory groups that externally look at a protocol or a study guide to basically kind of double check. So it's another set of eyes of what's happening with a patient's therapy that can be very helpful. And for a patient on a clinical trial, typically there may be more people involved in their care. They may have, in addition to the standard research team, clinical team, doctors, nurses, physician assistants, etc., there also may be other coordinators or research nurses or others that are participating, just to give research pharmacists, just to give another set of eyes and a double check on the treatment. And I think that adds an extra layer of comfort and oversight into what a patient is receiving and that everything is being done correctly. A second part of things is that the benefits include that that's how we learn. And everything we learn, everything that when a doctor or a caregiver speaks to a patient and a family, everything that they're told is developed, that knowledge is developed and imparted through patients who participated in clinical trials or clinical studies that told us, yes, this is a better treatment or a worse treatment, or here are the side effects. So that's important. Additionally, all of the new treatments that are out there and all of the advances that are out there happen because of clinical trials. And so that's how we move forward. Clinical trials present new options for patients. So you may receive a standard therapy, or you may receive, again, a twist on a standard therapy or some sort of new alternative that's at least worth considering. Clinical trials not appropriate for everyone, but it can be something that offers a patient perhaps a treatment that might be more effective or might have less side effects. Now, going into a clinical trial, we're studying the regimen, we're gathering information, so there are no guarantees about any of this, but it does offer alternatives, it does offer new approaches that for some people might ultimately offer a benefit. To a newly diagnosed patient with mantle cell lymphoma, I think there are some very important messages to keep in mind. The first is that you need to be informed. You need to understand your disease. Lymphoma in general, and mantle cell lymphoma specifically, can be very different than other tumors, say more common cancers like breast cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer. So you have to understand what lymphoma is about, the approach to lymphoma. You have to think about what the goals of treatment are. Do I even need treatment? Some patients with mantle cell lymphoma don't need treatment. So asking about kind of what the situation is, what the options are, understanding the disease, understanding what the possibilities are, the pros and cons, and the goals of treatment, to come up with a regimen that is appropriate for what you as a patient are seeking to achieve is really very important. I think another aspect of things is to have access to someone who's an expert in mantle cell lymphoma, if you can, or at least someone who sees a reasonable number of mantle cell lymphoma patients. Lymphomas are less common tumors. Mantle cell lymphoma only accounts for about 5 to 10% of patients with lymphoma. So many general oncologists who see many patients with breast cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer may only see one patient with mantle cell lymphoma or a handful of patients with mantle cell lymphoma every year, or maybe even every few years. And so having someone or access to someone, even if they are not practically your primary oncologist because you live in an area where you don't have access to many physicians specializing in lymphoma, but at least accessing for an opinion or when you have a decision point in your therapy can be very important, or at least seeking out information so that you can make sure that you get the information you need to make the right decisions. And then again, I would go back to clinical trials and say participation with a clinical trial or exploring whether or not a clinical trial is appropriate for you as a patient. Even if you don't decide to do it at a given point in time, it may be something you use in the future. Staying informed about what those options are. Is that a possibility for you? Is there value for that, for you to participate in that trial? And I think really lastly is staying connected with organizations like the Lymphoma Research Foundation, which really provides information and access to patients no matter where you are on the latest cutting edge information on what's available in mantle cell lymphoma, what's on the horizon, and how you can best navigate this journey as you sort through the choices and the challenges that you have to face.